Introducing Watson for Cybersecurity. Watson constantly researches online.
The Guardian newspaper has run a headline accusing Russia of being behind a cyber attack on the UK Parliament on Saturday. That's despite the fact, though, that the intelligence sources it relies on don't directly make that claim. Well, as many as 90 accounts belonging to MPs and peers were compromised as a result of the hack, and more than 10,000 people were told to change their passwords. And politicians were also denied access to their emails on devices outside of Westminster as a precaution. Well, Russian hackers have a short but quite a remarkable history of accusations being thrown their way. It all started, you might remember, with the alleged meddling of the US presidential election in 2016. Then over in France, Russians were accused of a massive email breach of then French presidential candidate Emmanuel Macron. The French government cybersecurity agency later dismissed the allegations, and then in another unfounded case, Russia was accused of attacking an American power grid in the state of Vermont. And it doesn't end there either. We can have a look at more. More recently, Russian hackers were blamed for sending out fake messages on behalf of the Qatari government, sparking the Gulf's biggest diplomatic crisis in decades. And then there's today's allegations reported in the British media saying that Moscow are the main suspects in a cyber attack on the UK's Parliament. Well, political analyst Chris Banbury says that despite the media allegations, there's nothing solid to suggest Russia is responsible.
You have to start by saying there's no hard evidence whatsoever that the Russian government is behind this. This is a suspicion, and suspicion has been presented almost as fact in so much of the British media. But I think also any viewer might want to think about who might have it in for the British government internationally. And the list of culprits would be a very lengthy one indeed, given Britain's involvement in various wars and adventures around the world. So why it narrows down to Russia, I don't really know. I mean, North Korea has also been mentioned. It would seem to me that what information you're going to get from an MP's mailbag is more useful to those interested in crime rather than national security.
Now, Eric says that he thinks this is the court moving far to the right, but this is a 9-0 Supreme Court decision. We don't see those all that often, so I'm just going to give you my kind of bird's eye view. I don't know if it's a conservative or right-leaning move by the court, as much as it's really a legal no-brainer that the president enjoys broad authority on these issues of immigration.
I used to teach constitutional law before I became Secretary of State, and I think the constitutional arguments against the ban are really weak. I mean, totally unprecedented arguments. And then on the statutory argument against the ban, it's a pretty weak one too, the way the Supreme Court has traditionally interpreted those statutes to give the executive a lot of authority. So I'm not surprised that it's 9-0. And the other thing I would point out is something some people haven't caught on to yet. The Supreme Court won't hear the case until October, and they won't decide the case till November at the earliest. So that 90 days is going to go, that 120 days on the refugee ban is going to go, or the pause. And so
it might be moot.
It might be almost moot, and the exception that the court carved out was already sort of in the executive order in the first place, but it had an exception.
2.0.
In 2.0 and in 1.0, there had an exception for cases of extreme hardship, which would be people who had family in the country. So I think it's a really big victory for the president. And one other quick point, for the country as well, one thing I've written about recently is that our refugee program has become a conduit for terrorists. Just since the original World Trade Center attacks in '93, we've had about 30 major terrorists use the refugee program to stay in the country or to get into the country.
Now, Ari, obviously there have been some examples of that, for sure, we know that, but there are also refugees that really are just seeking safe haven here. What is your take on how to reconcile those two realities?
There is a statutory argument for what the court has done, but there's also a clause in that very Immigration and Naturalization Act that the court is going to cite. And that clause trumps the earlier law, and that says you cannot discriminate nor use preferential treatment based on national origin and place of birth. That is a statutory argument.
And that's one of the reasons, by the way, Ari, that preference for Christian minorities was taken out for 2.0.
Exactly, and also place of birth. You have people from Iran, Sudan, Syria, and so on and so forth, Yemen and Somalia. That targets their place of birth and national origin. In addition to that, there are constitutional elements here: due process, equal protection, and the establishment clause. But the bigger scheme of things is this. Let's just go back 65 years ago. Can you imagine not admitting Albert Einstein? Can you imagine not admitting people who were deemed to be troublemakers, to be outside agitators?
We do realize this is a temporary travel ban while we figure out how our vetting system is, so that we can reopen the immigration status, not only to refugees, but also people who want to come over on visas. We're trying to make it a safer place, all right? We're not saying, no, Albert Einstein and the likes can never come here. He is just trying to say, until we're positive that we can close loopholes in the vetting system, we're going to pause it.
And which is what he's trying to do. And we all know what he's trying to do is trying to appeal to some of the most hardline elements within his own party. The travel ban is not not going to solve any of these issues.
Not a bad. It's a temporary.
If you're going to have ideological tests, if someone is an ISIS sympathizer, he or she can very easily lie through those interviews and so on and so
I think there are a lot of Americans outside of the hard base that are concerned with the fact that you have Attorney General Sessions saying that there are 300 refugees. There are active FBI investigations for terrorist-related activities or concerns. And mind you, too, these countries are either state harbors of terrorism or state sponsors of terrorism. So I think there are a lot of Americans outside of his base that are generally concerned given those facts.
Well, I'm one of those people outside the base, and I'm
Like
and I do have real concerns about national security, to your point, Lisa. And so some of the argument is that this travel ban doesn't necessarily make us safer. That's at least what I believe the Fourth Circuit determined. But then, you know, some of these places, if the president can make the argument that this is truly a national security issue, then I don't think I agree with you. There's not very much challenge that's going to circumvent that. I think, though, what I see from this court, tell me what you think about this prediction, the burden has shifted. This will not be about the president proving that it's actually a national security interest. It will be about opposition proving that they're going to have to prove that this is discriminatory.
No, it's not even that. He doesn't have to prove he's going to be right about it.
No, that's what I just said. That's what I just said.
He doesn't have to prove that. It's constitutional.
That's what I'm saying. The burden has shifted. He doesn't have to prove it's that anymore. I agree, Eric, but the opposition will have to prove that it has a discriminatory intent, is what Ari's argument is.
You know, in legal terms, the burden hasn't shifted, but in sort of practical terms, yes.
Public opinion.
In public opinion, because they now kind of know that the Supreme Court is very skeptical. In the short opinion, they showed some of the reasons they were skeptical of the Fourth Circuit and the Ninth Circuit. And on the statutory argument, the president has clear authority. The Fourth Circuit said, well, you have to show that it's good for the country to us on the judiciary. And what the statute doesn't say the president has to make a showing to anybody. It's in his view as chief executive, is this safe for the country? Do not lose sight of the fact that this was a 9-0 victory for Trump.
Well, this is not a 9-0 vote by the Supreme Court making a decision about a case that will be binding. They said, guess what, we're going to look at this. And guess what? 3 of the most conservative justices in the court, Alito, Gorsuch, and Thomas, actually dissented.
Because they wanted to go further.
Right. Usually, exactly. But they wanted to say, this is it. It's over. Just give the president carte blanche. But usually these opinions are about a paragraph or 2 paragraphs long. This was a 16-page decision or non-binding decision. That means it's a very complex
issue. At least 3 liberal judges did not vote against.
Which is to my point.
Did not vote against.
I don't think it's
the travel temporary ban in place for now.
Right, which I think proves my point. I don't think it's them being further to the right as much as it's just not that political of an issue. It's just pretty constitutional.
How do you explain the Ninth Circuit and the Fourth Circuit?
Well, for them it was. Unfortunately, no, really. For them,
I agree.
For the Ninth Circuit, yeah, but the High Court, thankfully, I wipe my brow, is being a little better than that.
I agree with that. And I would just add that, to Ari's point earlier, it's not a political thing that the administration did in issuing this ban in the first place in January. If you look at, for example, Syria, the previous administration had been granting 93% of Syrian refugee applications. This is at the same time that it's Syrian so-called fake refugees who are going in and detonating bombs in Europe and driving vehicles into people in Europe. And so clearly, 93% was a little too high. And so we have to figure out a way of separating out the true refugees from those who are claiming refugee
But it has certainly become a political issue because you've seen this. This is sort of one of the cornerstones of the resistance movement because this is emblematic to them of racism, xenophobia, whatever else the president has been accused of and was accused of during the campaign as well. So this has certainly become a political battleground, if you will. And so I think that also adds to the heaviness of this and whatever the Supreme Court's decision ends up being.
We have a big refugee program problem, not refugee problem, refugee program problem. Once we vet them, or say 18 to 24 months, whatever it takes, we let them come in and then we don't follow them. Once they're assimilated into whatever societies they are, communities, then they're free to go. So there's literally a period of time where we keep an eye on it. Maybe it's a year or so, I'm not sure, Chris, depends on the case. Some go for many years. And then we let them go.
And you just made my point, unlike Europe.
That scares me. And that's why this 120-day moratorium is not a bad idea to make sure that we really want to do that.
I'm all for vetting. My parents and I moved to this country. We waited for a green card. We came here, and look at where I am now.
On
But-
Fox News, that's good.
Well, that's
At the
It's
same
bad
level,
business.
all right, Mom, at 5 p.m., just enjoying the day.
exactly. So, but look at the facts. When immigrants or refugees leave Syria to go to Europe, all they have to do is to cross a non-existent European Union border, and they get to the European Union. We don't have that problem here. We have two oceans protecting us. 18 to 24 months.
There's four sides though.
Well,
We have two oceans, but there's a north and a south.
Right, very
that they
few,
can walk right
very
across
few
that
refugees go to
non-existent
Guatemala and
border.
cross up to Mexico, come out here. But again, 18 to 24 months is what it takes. They have to go through a DOD interview, Department of Homeland Security interview, the background check by the FBI, and the State.
Is there an opportunity for terrorists to come through, Syrian refugees, terrorists
Yes.
or not, to come through our southern border? Yes, absolutely. So there's two halves to this program. There's the refugee program where you're abroad, you get the status there. But a lot of people claim asylum, and that is they come in illegally across the Mexican border. They're smuggled in by the same people who smuggle in people who are from Mexico. And then once they're here, they claim asylum, and it's a very similar standard, a similar program. You get the same benefits of a refugee, and they too can just disappear into the fabric of the country when their asylum claim is denied. So we have to make sure we stop people at the front end where there's any question at all that this person isn't really a refugee. This is a person using the refugee program as a cloak to get in.
Okay, we definitely have a vetting problem, Eric. I agree with you there, and I look forward to us legally and constitutionally limiting that. So coming up.
الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله الله أكبر ولله الحمد الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله الله أكبر الله أكبر ولله الحمد الله أكبر الله
Tuesday with Florence Domino. Hello there. We're going to start off with a sort of back to school. I can imagine new satchels, freshly sharpened pencils, new shoes. I always liked the new shoes when I was going back to school. Much more serious matters though than school, really. We've got 577 members of parliament getting back to work. 424 of them are brand new. That's incredible, isn't it?
Out with the old, in with the new. It's really funny to see the puns in the French press today. Let's start with Aujourd'hui en France, Le Parisien.
it's not quite a pun, but just a great description of what this first day of school is. They're liking it to a debutante ball. I love that.
What is going on here? All right, guys.
ब्रेक के बाद एक बार फिर स्वागत है आप सभी का फास्ट एंड फैक्ट्स में।
प्रधानमंत्री मोदी इस वक्त नीदरलैंड्स में है और इस वक्त एक ज्वाइंट प्रेस कॉन्फ्रेंस को संबोधित किया जा रहा है। आइए सीधे आपको वहीं ले चलते हैं।
मिलने का भी अवसर मिलेगा। इंडियन डायस्पोरा हमारे बीच का एक जीवंत सेतु है और हम पीपल टू पीपल लिंक्स को मजबूत करने की दिशा में और भरपूर प्रयत्न करते रहेंगे।
Today also I will have an opportunity to meet people of Indian origin living in the Netherlands. The Indian diaspora here is a living link and bridge between the two countries. It is also our endeavor to further strengthen these people-to-people contacts.
मेरे लिए यह भी सौभाग्य की बात है कि आज His Majesty the King and Her Majesty Queen के से मिलने का भी अवसर मिलेगा। मैं उनसे मुलाकात करने के लिए बहुत ही उत्सुक हूँ।
For me, indeed, it is a matter of good fortune that I will also be calling on His Majesty the King and Her Majesty the Queen, and indeed, I'm looking forward to my meeting with them.
मैं एक बार फिर प्राइम मिनिस्टर रूटे और नेदरलैंड्स की सरकार का और यहाँ के जनता का हृदय से आभार प्रकट करता हूँ। धन्यवाद।
Once again, let me express my heartfelt thanks and for Prime Minister Rutte, for the government of Netherlands and the Dutch people. Thank you.
Thank you.
तो नीदरलैंड्स में रहने
Anastasia Churkina reports next on how it might not, though, be the damage control that Mrs May had been hoping for.
It was smooth enough sailing for Theresa May until she decided to make things just a little bit better for herself. Instead, it was a miscalculated gamble. An easy grab of an overwhelming parliamentary majority turned out to be a far-off dream. The prospect of a stronger negotiating hand with Brussels crashed and burned, with a hung parliament putting Theresa May's future into question.
Are you resigning from? You stepping down, Mrs. May? May must go! May must go! May must go!
Instead of stepping down, the British Prime Minister had a different plan. But it seemed like whichever way she turned, there was potential for trouble. The Tories have penned a deal with the Democratic Unionist Party of Northern Ireland, which is opposed to a hard Brexit, something May has accepted as a possibility. On top of that, the DUP have been criticized for their policies on same-sex marriage and abortion, as well as previous links with violent paramilitary groups in Northern Ireland. Not a perfect ally, but the 10 DUP MPs have been crucial for Theresa May. So much so, she was to Northern Ireland. And who is footing the bill, you may ask? As always, the taxpayer.
Taxpayers resent politicians cooking up deals behind closed doors that invariably end with their cash being thrown wherever is politically advantageous, rather than where it could be best spent.
Theresa May called it a good deal, and the DUP are delighted. If you think the same applies to Scotland and Wales, think again.
This is the worst kind of pork barrel politics, which has shredded the last vestiges of credibility of this wicked Prime Minister.
It is outrageous that the Prime Minister believes she can secure her own political future by throwing money at Northern Ireland whilst completely ignoring the rest of the UK.
Despite the British government having now plastered together a solution, the question is, for how long will it stick? After all, the irony is that a mere 7 Tory MPs switching sides would potentially be enough for a majority to slip away.
This was
The
50
Trump
minutes ago.
administration is getting ready to put its temporary travel ban in place. It will stop most visits from 6 mainly Muslim countries for 90 days. The Supreme Court yesterday threw out lower court orders blocking the ban. The president called it a, quote, great day for America's future security and safety. Jan Crawford is outside the Supreme Court. Jan, good morning.
Well, good morning. So, President Trump has been slapped down at every turn by the appeals courts, but the justices get the last word. And yesterday, they all agreed to allow at least part of his travel ban. So in the next few days, the government will stop denying visas to certain travelers from those 6 countries considered safe havens for terrorism.
We will destroy radical Islamic terrorism.
President Trump reaffirmed his commitment to national security during a visit Monday by the Indian Prime Minister. But except for that tweet, steered clear, reacting to his administration's victory.
Thank you very much, everybody.
The unsigned opinion announced by Chief Justice John Roberts said preserving national security is an urgent objective of the highest order. It's a unanimous rebuke to 2 federal appeals courts that halted the ban nationwide after those courts found it violated federal law and amounted to unconstitutional religious discrimination against Muslims. Reaction from immigrants' rights groups was swift.
This Muslim and refugee ban is unjust, it is un-American, and we will continue to fight it in the courts and in the streets.
This is kind of a slap to the face of Muslims around the country and even around the world.
But the court stopped short of allowing the president's full ban to take effect, saying it would not apply to immigrants who have a bona fide relationship with a person or entity in the United States, such as a close family member or a position at an American company or university.
I think it's premature to call this, a victory or a non-victory.
Hawaii Attorney General Doug Chin, who fought against the ban, called that provision a partial win, but said his state could still be negatively affected.
Anybody outside of the United States who's watching everything that's happened, there's no question, that what has happened has created a chilling effect.
Now, the justices scheduled arguments for October, but the administration had originally said it needed this travel ban while it reviewed immigration vetting procedures. So by then, this whole case could be moot. Gail? All right, Jan, thank you.
Pressure on the White House with a warning that its latest proposal to replace Obamacare would result in a further 22 million Americans losing insurance. The warning came as the vice president tried to reassure a delegation of citizens with healthcare problems.
So I'm begging you, please, please, whatever it takes, we've got to get this fixed. It's destroying people. It's destroying me. So please.
The White House has dismissed the warning about the draft Republican bill from the non-partisan Congressional Budget Office as inaccurate.
Thank you for sharing your heart. And I promise you, the President and I and our whole team are not going to stop working until we get this thing done.
Thank you.
The Democrats described the latest warning on the Republicans' draft bill as jaw-dropping.
Congressional Budget Office. Today's report confirms what doctors, patient advocates, Democrats, and Republicans have been saying for weeks. Trump care will lead to higher costs for less care and will lead to tens of millions of Americans left without any insurance.
The Congressional Budget Office says over the next decade, 49 million people will be uninsured under the draft bill, compared with 28 million under Obamacare.
This is what Florida's coral reef looked like in the 1970s.
I was lucky enough to see it when it was healthy. My children just saw it right before it really started to decline. But, you know, I don't think their children will, unless we can do something. The fish populations were strong, the shell populations were amazing, lobster were everywhere. I mean, it was just, I know that was my ground zero when I first saw it, but it was, you know, it's been over the years we've seen spurts of degradation.
Now, much of the coral that makes up the world's third largest barrier reef is dead or dying. Warming waters and disease are destroying it and threatening the economy that relies on it. Marine biologists from the Nature Conservancy showed the Washington Post some of the dead and diseased coral off Key Largo.
In the Florida Keys and Caribbean alone, reefs have been declining since the 1970s, and it's things like coral disease, coral bleaching, poor water quality, and even natural stressors like hurricanes or other tropical storms.
So it's like, you know, why does anyone care for the Grand Canyon or any of the other treasures of our country? You know, there's an intrinsic value just in the fact that they are there and they're beautiful and they give pleasure, as well as, you know, in this case, it also provides for, you know, an amazing economy and a delicious source of healthy food.
You got a gauge there.
Mimi Stafford, who was a marine biologist and now works as a commercial fisherman, has served on several advisory boards in hopes of preserving the reef as well as the fishing industry in the Florida Keys.
Yeah, it's warm. The water's really warm. I'm concerned. I believe that the emphasis is not on taking care of the environment, and that worries me for the future, for our population, for all the other animals that don't really have a say in this.
Most of our commercially important fish species, particularly down here, are at some point of their life cycle, they depend on reefs.
If we were to see this ecosystem collapse, we would see an entire economy collapse here in the Florida Keys.
But there may be a way to save and restore the reef before it's all gone.
What we've been doing is planting thousands and thousands of these corals that have declined in their populations to reefs where restoration is needed the most. So over the past 10 years, we've outplanted over 30,000 coral fragments to these reefs. And we've seen really great success in the sites that we've planted them on. Some sites haven't been as successful as others, but these are all really important things to understand as we move forward in these restoration programs. What sites work better than others? Why are they working better than others? These are all questions that a lot of people have working in restoration programs, and it's something that we can help address in the future.
Well, for more on this story, we're now joined by Kevin Lovell, who's the CEO of the South African Poultry Association. Thanks so much for joining us. I suppose these things come and go over time. Has this been a surprise?
Well, it's the first time we've ever had a highly pathogenic avian influenza in chickens in South Africa. It's been in ostriches, not this strain, a few times in the last 10 years or so. But it is a bit of a shock to us following the outbreak in Zimbabwe. And I guess like most farmers, we think, oh, it's somebody else's problem. And all of a sudden, it's now our problem. It's not somebody else's problem. It's not a big problem yet. The chickens that are affected, 2 farms now. One is the broiler farm that you're using the number of 24,000 from. That's a farm that produces the baby chickens, which will grow out to what we eat. It's a tiny, tiny percentage of what we would normally eat, no risk to supply. The next farm which have been affected is a laying egg farm, the eggs that we eat, and about 1% of the national flock is now affected. It also won't have a big impact.
How does it manifest? How did we get it?
Well, these are birds, and diseases fly. You know, other animals, they jump and they walk. So now you can't stop wild birds flying, and this is a present from Europe. The Europeans have had major outbreaks, more than 1,000 in chickens in the last year, more than 1,600 in wild birds. Those wild birds have flown down, their route takes them to the Western Cape. I think they get to the epicenter of Colombia and get a fright and rush back. But what they've done in the process is they've actually infected local wild birds, water birds. And it's likely that the outbreaks so far come not directly from the European wild birds, but from those that they infected on their way down and their way back. That means that there's a good chance that the disease could spread. The US had a very big outbreak about 1.5 years ago, 233 outbreaks, 30 odd were from wild birds, the rest were from people, hence government's order. But as viewers saw in that clip, this is people's livelihoods. So we're meeting with the government, with the Department of Agriculture tomorrow in an emergency response team meeting, and we'll be assessing how do we manage disease management and people's livelihoods and try and find the right balance.
Let's talk about those two things. Let's start with the disease management. It's on 2 farms at the moment.
Okay.
How do you contain it? Is it possible?
Well, you can't stop it getting in because of the work that something went wrong in those 2 farms' biosecurity, and we don't know definitively yet, but you can stop it spreading. So the farms are quarantined, nothing goes in or out. All of the birds will be depopulated. Those that are actually sick will be depopulated quickly, and you use different methods. Those that are in the infected area will be gradually depopulated in a slightly more humane way, so that you get rid of all the possibility of disease spread. Then you go through a careful cleaning process. You do a lot of sampling and checking. About 6 months from now, those farms will be able to be refilled.
They're set down for 6 months.
About it could be slightly less or slightly more depending on a few steps in the way.
And then the other side now is the selling of live hens, which is
it's a livelihood for many people. Yeah. And those live hens are actually what we call spent hens, which is a right term for meaning they're finished, they're tired, they're not productive hens anymore, and they're sold live. Not actually, as your clip said, because they're cheaper, because actually they're more expensive, but because they taste almost the same and have a similar texture to village chickens, because they're old chickens. The chickens most people eat are babies or teenagers. They don't taste the same. And
so the taste, it's for the taste.
It's for boiling as opposed to broiling or grilling or things
like that. So what do they do? Is it the whole country or just that area that they can't sell live hens?
The order is for the whole country because the hens move around the whole country. And that's one of the things we'll be discussing tomorrow. How do we manage the risk and livelihoods and find a good balance that minimizes harm to, because it's mostly the smaller farmers and traders who are going to suffer, and the likelihood of disease spread, knowing that people are the main agent for spreading this disease. It's not going to be an easy conversation. There isn't a right or a wrong answer, and some people will lose out.
How long could this last?
Well, it depends how many more outbreaks we get, and it's too early to predict. Obviously, because I'd like to be positive, we'd like to believe we've done it now, this is enough, but it is realistically possible it could be more.
Okay, so then how is it that we can still go to the shops tomorrow and buy chicken and it'll be fine?
Because the amount of broilers, the breeders that made the broilers, the amount affected is tiny. The amount of eggs laying hens affected is tiny, about 1%. That's why they're all going to be there. And there'll be a way of compensating. If it spreads, it actually can have an impact on food availability and food security. This strain isn't bad for humans. There are some avian influenzas that are, and there's about almost 2 years of European experience of this for us to know that the risk to humans there is no risk, actually.
So one of the things that we have to do is report to our neighbours that we've had this outbreak.
Correct.
How does that affect our exports and trade?
2 ways. Is that we're a member of the World Organization for Animal Health, South Africa that is, and so everyone reports. When the Zimbabweans had their outbreak, they reported and we immediately stopped trade. There was very little trade. Now we have it, so we reported, and all of the importing partners have the right to say no, but we have a system called compartments, where basically we say we know exactly what's going on in that particular space, and if the importing country accepts the compartment, and a number do, then trade will continue. There might be a short gap while they say, please do some extra tests, but it's their call, it's not our call. They must say, yes, we're happy, we think it's safe.
So, I mean, I feel reassured, and I hope that's a good interpretation of the things that you're saying. But so we have the capabilities and the science and the expertise to manage this kind of scenario, so that we need not fear too much.
We have the African expert on avian influenza as a research professor at the University of Pretoria, the Honors Degree faculty. We have a range of other sets of expertise. No one knows everything. That's why the disease came in. But South Africa is well positioned to manage this. There's a very, very close relationship with the Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries and us. In fact, lots of meetings every day throughout the day, weekends as well, as we cooperatively work together. And that's why we're meeting tomorrow, is what are we doing right? What do we need to change? We will develop this. South Africa has experience with ostriches. It's a different bird and there's some differences, but we're not at sea. But to reassure people, this one is not dangerous for humans. Okay. The outbreaks so far are very limited. They won't have an effect. There is a risk, of course, it could spread. And you as viewers can help. If you see any wild bird mortality, especially near water sites, please tell the Department of Agriculture or tell us. There could be other reasons why they're dying, and then we'll go and look and make sure, and we'll control, but we need your support. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed, Kevin Lovell.